Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am Jane Hauser. I'm the Director of Marketing and Outreach at NESCA, and I'm joined by Jasmine Badamo, and she's an executive function coach and educational counselor here at NESCA. We're here today for the webinar, Supporting Your Child's Executive Function Development. And I just wanted to alert everyone that the chat function is enabled. And we're asking that you just use that really to kind of talk amongst yourselves and let me know if you're having any technical difficulties. There will be a live Q&A at the end of the presentation. So please do feel free to put any questions you have in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, but we will get to those at the end of the presentation. Jasmine is also going to share the presentation with you in the chat, a link to the presentation, and we will also be doing a follow-up for everyone in an email. I'll include the presentation there as well. And with that, I will turn things over to Jasmine. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Jane. It's lovely to be here today. Thank you for sharing your lunch hour with us. Today, like Jane said, we'll be talking about how to support your child's executive function development. And Jane, if maybe you could put the PDF in the chat for me, I can't seem to share it with all the participants.
Sure.
I appreciate
I'll try. Thanks.
So just to get us started, I want to do a quick run through of our agenda for today's webinar. Today, we are going to focus on foundational ways to create a supportive setting for your child's executive function development. So with that in mind, we will start with some introductions and a brief background on executive functioning and executive function demands. And then we'll get into the foundational ways that you can support your child's executive function development. We'll wrap up with some time for Q&A and discussion, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time to really discuss the questions that you guys have. So I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Jasmine Badamo. I am dual licensed in New York State to teach English to speakers of other languages, as well as students with disabilities. I received, after several years of teaching, a professional certificate in learning differences in neurodiversity from Landmark College. And in that program, we specialized in executive functioning. So currently, I am working with individuals from 7 years old all the way through young adults, with a focus on college students is kind of the bulk of my clientele right now. And that falls under NESCA's executive function coaching program. We are including in the PDFs a link to my bio, so feel free to click there if you'd like to read a little bit more. Next, a little introduction to our group practice. NESCA was founded in 2007 as a neuropsychology practice. So we were offering evaluations for students who were seeking a diagnosis or questioning a diagnosis and needed documentation for services and accommodations. We currently have a staff of about 25 clinicians across various locations. We're in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, where I am, internationally as well. And we offer our services both in person and remotely, as you can imagine with our international clients. All of our clinicians are master's and doctoral level professionals in their relevant field, and that includes neuropsychologists, transition specialists, occupational therapists, special educators such as myself, school psychologists, and social workers. And while we are a small practice, we take a lot of pride in the fact that we have a wide range of expertise. In 2009, NESCA started offering transition services, and that is in addition to our neuropsychological evaluations. So the transition services include post-secondary transition planning and assessment services. That's for students with IEPs, real life skills, pre-college, and career coaching for help with the life skills and getting ready for post-high school life, whether that be a job, college, vocational training, etc. We offer executive function coaching to support students with their organization, scheduling, time management, goal setting, etc., all of those great EF skills. And we also offer parent coaching to give parents the tools to support the needs of their neurodivergent children and oftentimes to support the parents themselves. And lastly, we offer counseling for students who benefit from direct psychotherapy. My work as an executive function coach and educational consultant falls in the transition services, primarily in the real life skills, executive function coaching, and parent coaching. Lastly, at the center of NESCA's culture is our service approach, which is relational, student driven, collaborative, and individualized. So, given that we have our diverse expertise among our staff, we are really able to be thoughtful and find the right fit between the individual and the coach that we match them with. So we specialize in the evaluation and treatment of children, adolescents, and young adults with signs of the following. It includes reading problems, language-based disabilities, autism spectrum disorders, ADHD, fetal alcohol syndrome disorders, executive functioning deficits, emotional issues, trauma and stress-related disorders, as well as intellectual disabilities. Even though these are specialty areas, as far as who we work with, there is really no profile of clients that we are unable to treat, including lower incidence disabilities such as sensory impairments related to hearing or vision. So oftentimes at NESCA, we receive a lot of those clients who have complex presentations and they don't fit neatly into a diagnostic category. And that's really where we flourish because of our range of expertise. We're able to really pull from different people to provide the best supports for the individual. So now that we've given a little introduction to myself and to our group practice, just a quick overview of our presentation. The PDF, as Jane and I spoke about, should be in the chat now. So if you would like that to follow along with, feel free to download that now. We will also be sending out a PDF version of the webinar afterwards that will include speaker notes, additional information, and some links that might be helpful resources for you. In terms of video, obviously feel free to have camera on or off, however you feel most comfortable. And we will keep everyone muted during the presentation, but as Jane mentioned, the chat will be open if you'd like to share anything. And then of course the Q&A will also be open and we'll set time aside at the end for that. I would love it if now we could actually test out the chat and have participants introduce themselves. If you'd like, give just a brief introduction of your name, where you are, if you are here on behalf of a child, what age or grade are they in, and maybe just a brief purpose for being here. It's always helpful to know who's in the room so that you can connect with each other if there's someone else who may be in a similar situation. So we will have the chat open and feel free to pop any introductions in there while I get started with the other slides. All right, so getting started first with the basics. What are executive functions? Executive functions are a set of cognitive and regulatory skills that are necessary for engaging in goal-directed behavior. So in other words, they're brain functions that we all have that allow us to set a goal and then take all of the necessary steps in order to complete that goal. As you can imagine, there's lots of goals that we set in life and all of the steps leading up to that, lots of steps. So executive function skills are kind of everywhere. A really great example to see just how many executive function skills are just in our everyday. If your child has to prepare for a cumulative end of unit exam in math in 2 weeks' time, let's say they're ahead of the game, they've decided they really want to study for this, so they're thinking ahead 2 weeks, which in and of itself is already a great accomplishment that they're thinking that far ahead. Once they set that goal, there's still a whole slew of cognitive and regulatory skills or steps that they have to do in order to achieve that goal. So they have to remember the teacher's announcement about when the test is happening. And maybe, oh, yay, the chat's working. Thanks, everyone. You can start putting your introductions in now. Thanks, Jane. Um, so they have to remember the teacher's announcement about when the test is. And maybe the teacher said it while everybody was packing up their books and their belongings, lots of sensory information and distractions. So that's one step that they have to do. Then the other is they have to find the teacher's study guide, if there was a study guide that the teacher gave out. Was it digital in Google Classroom? Was it in paper? Which folder did I put that in? They have to track that down. They should track down notes that maybe they took, hopefully they took over the course of the school year, and put all of that together so they have the content that they want to study with. Then once they have all of that content together, all of that organizing, they still have to then do some time management and estimate how long it will take to review all that content. They need to pace it out over 2 weeks. They need to keep in mind their other time commitments, their other homework that's continuing to be given out during this time. Then after that, they might have to decide, what's the best study method for me? Do I know what works good for me and what doesn't? They decide that. They have to motivate themselves to study using the method that they've decided. Then they have to focus during that time, even when they would rather be doing something else, like hanging out with their friends or watching TV, or let's be honest, scrolling on social media. And then throughout all of that, there's also the regulatory skill of managing the frustration that might come up as they're doing their studying, or the anxiety or nervousness. So you can see how there's so many places where our executive functioning skills really come into play in academics, and then, as you can imagine, as well in our personal lives. And all of these steps that I've described here are still all separate from the actual math content learning itself. So, as well as being very ubiquitous, these executive function skills are very essential for academic success. Because executive functioning feels so all-encompassing and ubiquitous, it is very helpful to kind of break it down into sub-skills. And different places will kind of have slightly different sub-skills that they choose, but these are kind of the top 9 that I like to explain. So we have at the top organization. That includes organization of materials, organization of time, and organization of ideas. So can you keep your materials organized? Do you have a system for your school notes and notebooks? Are you not losing things? Can you organize the tasks that you have to do? Can you organize your ideas when you have to write a paper? So all of that is a part of the sub-skill of organization. And then there's planning and prioritization. This includes scheduling. So making a plan with steps to follow in order to reach a goal, knowing which activities are more important than others to prioritize your time and energy. We have time management. Everyone, I think, is very familiar with this one. This is finishing things in a reasonable amount of time. However, it also includes accurate time estimation. So knowing how long things will take you, not someone else, but you, in order to finish that task. Next is task initiation. I think a lot of parents may experience frustrations with this with their children. It is getting started on your work in a timely fashion, and it's managing that task avoidance. So it's kind of the opposite of procrastination. Then we have attention and effort. This is similar to what we think of with focus, but it's not just concentrating on the task that you're doing, it's sustaining that attention and sustaining that effort, having the stamina to concentrate on one thing or work on one thing for an extended period of time. Attention and effort also involves shifting your attention. So can you switch your attention or transition to a different activity when it is time to? Or could you shift your attention back to the activity you're meant to be doing if you're distracted? Next executive function sub-skill is working memory. This is an aspect of memory, but it's not exactly the same of what we think of with short-term or long-term memory. Working memory is the ability to hold more than one piece of information in your brain at the same time, and more accurately, being able to manipulate and utilize the information that you were holding in your brain. So, a great example would be when you were going grocery shopping, if you did not write down a grocery list, which I am not one of those people, but if you decided I'm going to hold the grocery list in my head, the working memory is holding the list of items in your head while you are actively searching for those items, holding it and utilizing the information. Next is self control. This is both impulse control and emotional control or emotional regulation. So, being able to stop and think before you act, and also being able to manage any emotions when they get too big or too intense. Self monitoring is the ability to self reflect and have accurate self awareness. So that would be noticing when you don't understand something and you would need to ask for help. It would also include reflecting on your patterns and strategies so that you can see if you need to modify them. And lastly, mental flexibility. This is the ability to not be rigid in your thinking. It includes being able to see things from multiple perspectives and also to acknowledge that there's more than one solution to a problem or more approaches to a goal than just one. So these are executive function sub skills, all of the skills that every human has capacity for, and we are all asked to utilize on a daily basis. And just a little bit more information about executive function development. While all humans possess these executive function skills, like any other skill, these skills develop over time, develop as we grow and mature, and our skill development and skill capacity varies from person to person. So some people do struggle with executive function skills more than others. That includes people with traits and or a diagnosis of ADHD, people with learning differences, people who are autistic, people facing mental health challenges, and people with chronic illnesses. So all of these factors can influence our capacity of executive function. It can influence our development of executive function, and it can also influence how much we're able to access our executive functioning skills in any given moment. Some other important notes about executive function development is that executive functioning ability is absolutely not equal to intelligence. Intelligence is often measured in a variety of ways anyway, but it's very common to see students that have very high intelligence and relatively low executive functioning ability. And that difference and gap can actually cause a lot of or be the source of a lot of the struggle. Next important note is that executive function differences are a natural part of human neurodiversity. It doesn't, just as all humans come in different shapes and sizes, so do our brains. And that is a normal part of our population to have variation there. And lastly, executive functioning skills naturally strengthen as we age because they're housed in the prefrontal cortex of our brain. We really aren't fully developed in our prefrontal cortex until we're 26 years old, which is crazy to think about the responsibilities we have before our prefrontal cortex is fully developed. But it can also be taught and strengthened at all ages. So just like any other skill, if we are given explicit instruction and repeated practice, it's possible to strengthen these executive function skills. Great. So now that we've gotten kind of a baseline on what executive functioning is, I'd like to talk a little bit about executive function demand. So an executive function demand is any task that requires the use of any of these executive function skills. And because there's so much overlap in these skills, it's very common that a task will actually require multiple executive function skills. And the level of demand that a person may experience from a task can vary depending on the task as well as the individual's mental capacity at the time. So, if you can imagine, I'm sure you have heard this before, that people who are diagnosed with ADHD experience a much higher executive function demand or burden for a task that other people may not feel is heavy as a burden. So it is very individualized what an executive function demand would be. Another example that I wanted to talk through is, again, going back to how ubiquitous executive function demands are. You can imagine that writing a 10-page paper requires the use of a lot of these executive functioning skills. You have to organize your research, you need to organize your thoughts, you need to plan out the flow of the paper. You need to manage your time to make sure you finish the paper by the due date. All of these skills are probably involved in writing a 10-page paper. However, there are also executive function demands with things as simple as brushing your teeth. You still need to do time management when brushing your teeth to figure out when you need to brush your teeth, how long it will take you, how do you adjust the other activities in your morning routine or night routine to brush your teeth. You need to take the task initiation. You might need to do some self control if you have any sensory issues. You need to regulate those big feelings that might come up and overcome them in order to brush your teeth. So sometimes executive function demands will arise in ways that we're not expecting, and they may present themselves differently from individual to individual. I wanted to show this pie chart here. I found this from parents.com. I will give the link following the webinar. And the title of this article was How Mental Load Sneaks into Your Everyday Life. I think mental load or cognitive load have become much more popular terms recently. I like to think about mental load as a form of executive function demand. It's you using all the thinking parts of your brain. This is an example of mental load for a parent in a day. You have to keep your kids alive, which is, I'm glad they put that as the first task to do. You're thinking about how all the kids had a growth spurt and you have to go buy more socks. Did you wash your hair? So you're thinking about yourself. Then you have guilt for thinking about yourself. Then you need to think about the dog, laundry, doctor's appointments, cleaning, meal planning, surviving the school year. And this is not an all-inclusive list. So if you can imagine all of the things throughout your day that take or put mental load or mental burden on you, you can imagine how many different executive function demands your child is being asked to complete, especially if they're currently in school. I have here a table to kind of show some of the common executive function demands that a student may experience across elementary, middle school, high school, and college. Again, this is not all inclusive, but just to have some concrete examples of when and where our children are experiencing mental load. In elementary school, it might be things simple as keeping school desk, study area, and your room clean. In middle school, it might level up to things like tracking assignments and pacing out long-term papers. And then in college, obviously, it will be one of the higher executive function demands. You need to coordinate your graduation requirements, deal with both life tasks such as medication management, as well as your academic tasks. And while our executive functioning ability does continue to develop and strengthen as we get older, so do the executive function demands. They increase in complexity. And sometimes a student's executive function development is not quite keeping up with the increase in the executive function demands. So that leads us into talking about foundational ways that you can support the executive function development of your child. Today, I wanted to focus on global strategies for supporting executive function rather than minute specific tips and strategies, because by following these foundational strategies, it can lay the groundwork for more targeted tips and tricks to be successful. Also, if you are able to kind of master and integrate these foundational strategies into your family, it will put you in a position where you can actually start to generate your own executive function support tips and tricks and kind of individualize it to yourself. So, the first suggestion is to shift your attitude around motivation and quote unquote laziness. Motivation is very complex. It's a widely studied topic, and yet it is still very often misunderstood. There's very few people that are intrinsically motivated. If you can even think about how many of us would go to work for 8+ hours a day, for 5+ hours a week, if we were not financially motivated, if we were not motivated to provide for ourselves and for our loved ones. So if you can imagine how hard it can be for us to muster intrinsic motivation, it can be even harder for our children to do so. And for individuals with executive function struggles, they can literally get stuck and not be able to take the first step. It is separate from motivation and willingness, or the motivation is separate from willingness, and it's just, it can feel impossible for them to take that first step. And aside from brain chemistry, emotional regulation, anxiety, depression, and perfectionistic thinking, they all play a significant role in motivation. So it is multifaceted and it can be motivated or influenced by many different factors. There are common sources of motivation for neurodivergent brain, including if something is urgent. I'm sure you all have experience with that. If something is novel or it's presented in a way of play or competition. If something is interesting, a lot of parents will tell me, well, I know that they can do it because they put all of this energy and effort into Fortnite, into Minecraft. So why can't they do it for homework? Homework's not interesting. So interest is a huge factor for motivation and challenge. If something is an exciting challenge that they can prove themselves or a competition, that's also a motivating factor. However, these motivating factors are not always found in our environments, or it may be difficult to generate them. So motivation is something that can be very elusive and very difficult to muster up. The next note about this topic is that your perspectives influence the messaging that you send your children. So calling your child or using language like lazy or unmotivated around your children is not only counterproductive because you're not addressing the root causes or factors influencing their motivation, but you're also carrying a lot of negative implications that your children can pick up on. So when you call someone lazy or unmotivated, it may imply that one, your child is actively choosing to not exert effort in this. It is their choice, they're being willful. Another thing that you could be implying is that your child has an intrinsic personality flaw because they can't seem to muster this motivation you speak of. You may be implying that your child has personal responsibility for their motivation level when we know that any individual is not functioning in isolation. And you can be implying that your child holds the blame for any lack of success, where again, they're not functioning in isolation. So using this language can lead to some difficulties with their self-esteem, or actually be counterproductive and make them feel even less motivated to complete the task. In general, the goal is to shift from they're just lazy and don't care to they're struggling with motivation. If they could, they would, but their brain is making this difficult right now. So I know this isn't providing any hacks for how to solve motivation, but it is really important to consider shifting your attitude and your perspective around the concept of motivation and laziness. The next suggestion that I have is to get curious. So, if the first step is to rethink your perspective on motivation, then the next step is to get curious about what's going on beneath the surface. What are the underlying needs that your child has, and what are the barriers that are blocking them from meeting those needs? So we want to read into behavior and engage our children in metacognitive discourse. Metacognitive discourse means we are talking about how we think, how we feel, why we think that. We're doing a lot of that deeper self reflection. And you can ask yourself and ask your child, what is this behavior communicating to us? What is it that you're needing right now? So, a very simple example could be that a child is upset about not being able to watch their favorite TV show and they throw something or they hit their sibling. While we don't need to condone the behavior of hitting or violence, what we can do is get curious about the underlying need. And what that child may need in that moment is the ability to self regulate their disappointment and their frustration. So once we look deeper underneath, we're able to actually provide the supports and skills that our children need to continue developing in the direction we'd like them to. Another point for this is to avoid judgment and dismissiveness and instead strive for validation and normalization. Back to that example with the child who throws a toy after not being able to continue watching TV, we can normalize and validate that feeling of disappointment and frustration without validating the unhealthy or unsafe behavior, but we can still validate what's underneath there. And instead of judging them for having that feeling or having that need, we can make them feel seen and understood and heard. And lastly, we can model appropriate emotional management skills and self compassion. So once we meet our child's underlying need or emotion, then we can help our child move into problem solving mode where we help them get back into their thinking brain and figure out what they can do next time to make that a better situation. Excuse me. Third foundational way to support executive function development is to set your children up for success by prioritizing your focus and energy. It's really important to focus on a limited set of goals at a time. We want to make sure that we are keeping our goals realistic and attainable so that our children can experience success and that they can build on that success. One thing to remember is that we want to prioritize the realistic, attainable, and urgent skills that they need to develop and responsibilities that they need to take, and then try to help them take other things off of their plate so they can really focus their energy as well. The other thing to keep in mind is that they're little creatures. Even 20-year-olds are really, they're just babies, and they're all still developing their executive function skills. They are experienced a lot oftentimes when you get to a point where you're trying to figure out how to support your child's executive functioning. It's because they're currently in a state of overwhelm and they're struggling to manage it on their own. So validating that and helping them set limits on how much they're trying to tackle at any point in time can be really, really productive. The next point is to balance immediate and future goals by being honest and accepting of what's realistic for your child at this time. So similar to the first one, we want to keep our goals realistic and attainable. But what I mean by this is you want to start within your child's zone of growth. You may have heard the phrase, meet your child where they're at. So meet your child where they're at and see if you can push them to the next step a little bit further. but you're going to start from where they're at. We're not going to jump to step 50 if they're still on step one. It's also important that we um, focus on the basics, such as self care with eating, drinking, sleeping, and exercise before we tackle more complex executive function goals. And the last is to provide opportunities to utilize strengths and develop interests. A lot of time when students are struggling with their executive functioning, they're struggling with academics, it can feel like every single minute of the child's day is occupied with them thinking about the thing that they're not good at and them failing at the thing that they're not good at over and over again. So they're in school all day trying hard to keep it together. Then they're at home all day trying hard to keep it together. And it's really important that we don't burn our children out on them trying to work on their executive functioning. So it's good that we can balance giving them time to develop their interests and to utilize their strengths so that they can build the self confidence they need to have the stamina to keep working on their weak spots and work on their goals. It's also important that we don't over focus on our children's executive function struggles because we don't want them to over identify with them. We don't want our children to say, well, I'm just bad at time management. It is a skill that you're still developing, but that's not who you are. So I think giving time to let your child have balanced experiences can help them prevent them from over identifying with their executive function struggles. And the fourth way to support your child with executive function development is to be supportive through the struggles and mistakes. So that means that you allow your child to have struggles and to fail and to make mistakes, but that you stay consistent in your ability to support them and collaborate with them when they need to repair for the mistakes that they may have made. Back, I don't even remember what slide it was, but back in the beginning of this webinar, we talked about how executive function skills can develop with explicit practice, no, explicit instruction and repeated practice. So you may be providing the explicit instruction with your child, but if they don't have the real world practice of trying out this skill, not quite getting it, and feeling out how this works in the real world, it's going to be harder for them to develop that skill and to develop the independence that we ultimately want them to have. So it's important to have natural consequences rather than increased pressure to not fail. And it's important to collaboratively discuss, process, and support your children in their problem solving after they make a mistake. So they know that you will hold the boundaries that you set, that you will allow certain natural consequences to happen, but that you'll also be there to support them through it. It also helps our children build a lot of resilience towards failure, and it can prevent them from getting stuck in that place of not wanting to do something unless it's going to be perfect. And the other point in this topic is that, like I mentioned, the EF skills require direct instruction and opportunity to practice the skills that are taught. If we have time, I do have an example of how we can support our children through those mistakes and kind of some scripts that we can say, but I'll save that for the Q&A so that we can finish and have enough time. Okay, and the last way that you can support your child's executive function development is to know your child and personalize to them. That means that you're going to choose strategies that will be a good fit for your child. And when you're choosing a strategy, for example, scheduling, what type of calendar do we want to choose, a digital or a paper, Google Calendar or iPhone? You want to consider a host of factors. You want to think about what is the external situation? What is the demand that they have to meet? Is it academic or is it at home? What time of day will they be asked to be doing this task? What's going on in the world right now? You want to think about what environment your child is in right now and what will work best for their current environment. You also want to consider their age and developmental level and make sure that the strategy that you are offering your child is not placing more executive functioning demand on them or an executive functioning demand that's beyond their developmental level. You want to think about their learning profile and underlying challenges. So you want to choose a strategy that will support their challenges and play to their strengths. You want to think about their preferred ways of managing difficulties. So, based on the strategy or type of calendar that you choose, you can think through what might be the frustrations or the difficulties with using this tool or this strategy. And do we have ways to manage those frustrations and difficulties? Is it worth it? Should we try something else? And then, of course, you want to consider the mental load and fatigue that your child is experiencing and whether this strategy, as I mentioned before, will be adding to the mental load or will actually be alleviating their mental load. And lastly, whichever executive function support strategy you choose, you can and should adapt it to your child. Something that's really important to remember is that our children are not us, although there are lots of ways that they are. They are different from us. And just because a strategy makes sense to us and would work well for us doesn't necessarily mean it would work well for our child. So it's really important to include our children in our conversations about what calendar we're going to be using, what reminder system, what physical school supply organization system we're using so that we can really get input on what works for them and what doesn't. And it's also a really great opportunity for you to develop your child's self-awareness and have them doing those metacognitive discussions. So those are the 5 foundational recommendations for how to support your child's executive function development. For the Q&A, that gives us about 15 minutes. And I just put up here the 5 recommendations along with the different executive function skills, sub-skills that we discussed, just as a reference. And I think we can open it up to questions.
All right. We had one comment just about the topic of time blindness. I think you kind of touched on that a little bit, but if there's anything specific you want to add about that.
I think time blindness, I would say, let's see if we can go back to the list here. That would fall in the category of time management. So just as we mentioned here, some people struggle with executive function skills more than others. There are people, if they have executive dysfunction or ADHD or are autistic, they struggle with time management and struggle with the perception of the passage of time. I think all humans experience this. If we're having a good time, it could feel like time is flying by. If we're miserable and bored, every minute takes an eternity. But this can be even more exaggerated with people who have executive dysfunction or struggle with time management. I think one of the great things that we could do for people who experience that is to make things very visual or make it kind of undeniable. So they have something to kind of ground them in the accurate passage of time. I think the self monitoring is also really important. So you want to provide realistic feedback on how long or short something is taking them, and then kind of help them notice that pattern that, when you brush your teeth, I don't know why I keep going back to that, but when you brush your teeth, you actually need about 10 minutes to do it thoroughly. So let's make sure we set aside time, 10 minutes for that. So I think that's a really great way to address time blindness and to be kind with it, because I think we all experience it to some extent and sometimes.
And then just a quick Question, could you remind us about the definition of metacognitive?
Yes. So metacognitive means that you are thinking about your thinking. So meta means you're kind of going up a level to make something more abstract and less concrete. And then cognitive just refers to your thinking. So metacognitive discussions would be sitting down with your child and thinking about how do you learn? How do you take in information? How long does it take you to write a paper? So it's reflecting on your own thinking and on your own learning.
Great.
And I can pop a slide into the presentation that gives some like nice definitions of metacognitive so that we can send that out after the webinar.
Great. And we have another question here. My eldest with ADHD is moving into middle school, where he will have to switch classrooms every period. How do we help set him up for success when he struggles with EF skills, especially organization and planning, such as remembering his materials or organizing himself for class?
So again, I think I would go back to here and knowing your child and personalizing to them. So I would first try to identify what are the priority demands, kind of like the non-negotiables that we need to make sure to get him supports for. So if the biggest struggle is him getting to the next class on time, can we give him a watch that buzzes for him so that he has a physical reminder of when he needs to get to the next class? Um, Another, if the organization is really the top priority and the top struggle, then you can sit down and have those metacognitive discussions to reflect on what exactly is it about all these different papers that's the most overwhelming for you. Is it the number of papers? Is it that there are so many different classes? And then you choose the organization system that will reduce that overwhelm the most. So for some students, it's having a separate folder color coded for each class. For other students, having the separate folders adds to the overwhelm and the colors are too much. So instead, you might want to get one of those expandable folders where they can kind of have everything in one place, but they can still organize it. So it's very difficult to say this is the strategy you should use to support them with organization without first knowing what is your child's greatest challenge and what are their strong points or their strengths.
Great.
But my overall recommendation would be to loop your child into those conversations, especially in middle school. I think they're able to have those types of reflection conversations.
How do I help identify which areas we should prioritize? It seems that my child is challenged by several of these areas.
Yes, I think in that case, you should actually use your child's demands as a guide for what to prioritize. Because I think, like I mentioned, so many of these sub skills overlap, and I don't necessarily know if there's a benefit to separating them. I don't think it makes sense to, we're just going to work on time management, but we're not going to work on prioritization and planning. It's impossible to do that. So I think instead you should focus on what are the non-negotiable demands that my child has and how do we support them with those demands? And your support is going to overlap with all of these different skills. Um, I also think that a lot of times we will tell ourselves that everything is non-negotiable and everything is a priority. But if we're honest about what our capacity is, our child's capacity, our family's capacity, and then decide if this is our capacity, we have space for three priorities and everything has to be cut. It can be very difficult and sometimes not possible, but to the best of your ability, pare back what the demands are and what the priorities are so that your child can really focus on a few and develop a whole host of executive function skills while working on those top priorities.
Great. Assistive technology, what are some options? I've heard of color coding, setting a buzzing alarm. What are others for reading, note taking, etc.?
So the reading and note taking, I can start with that. The best support that I actually would recommend is to have students understand how their brain processes information. So I will actually go through with my, especially high school and college students, and teach them about the information processing model theory of how we take in information and how something can go from sensory input of the world into our long-term memory. And then that will kind of inform what are the important parts of uh, note taking and review and study, and then teach them this is why it's important to take notes. This is why it's important to organize your notes or to go back and review your notes. So that would kind of be like the support or the assistance for that. But I do think that in terms of the wider topic of assistive technology, it's really helpful to talk with your school district or your local CPAC because your options can change based on where you're at. I'm in New York, so our assistive tech is very different than up in Massachusetts or Boston. Um, and I think sometimes it's you might end up having more options than you even thought possible, or the other way around. You don't necessarily want to go researching a bunch of options for assistive tech if they're not quite compatible with your school district. Um, but some other basic ones that you could do at home are speech to text. So if your child, it's really takes a big it's a big mental load for them to type things out or write things out. You can have them do speech to text on Word documents. You can do the opposite, text to speech, if your students struggle with reading or they have a slower processing speed. There's a whole bunch. We could probably have, I think we have had whole webinars on assistive technology. So it's a lot.
Okay. Both of my ADHDers enter a new space, such as a restaurant or a doctor's office, at full speed, full on speed and high volume. Is there a cue I can give them to help develop this self-control, or how else can I support them?
I think, especially again, since they're teenagers, have that be a collaboration and talk with them. And I think the first step is to figure out how much of a problem is this? How much of a priority is this? So, this is what's like you start with this is what's happening, this is a situation. What are some of the pros of your way of going full steam ahead into a situation? What are the neutral aspects of it? And what are the negative consequences? Because it may be that the only negative consequence is that it's mildly socially embarrassing. And for your teenager, they're okay with that consequence, but maybe you're not, and you can also talk that through. But I think a lot of times it's helpful for us to take a step back and decide is this actually something that is damaging or unsafe and we need to figure out an alternative or support? Is this something that I'm just uncomfortable with and maybe I have to let that go and let my child be the firecracker that they are? Is this something that's worth my child's time and energy given that they have other priorities in their life right now? And once you have those kind of value, you figure out what your value system is and what your priorities are, then you could figure out, okay, this situation isn't working. What would we like the situation to be? And what can I do to support you? And a lot of times your teenager will actually come up with their own suggestions once you kind of sit down and have that conversation. It could be something as simple as a tap on the shoulder or like a signal of the ear, or it could be something where you have them doing a game on their phone to kind of keep them focused on that instead of kind of bringing their energy everywhere else. But I think the first step is to talk with your child.
And would that be the same for a younger child as well?
I think with a younger child, if they're like early elementary school, you should still have that collaborative conversation with them, but at their level. I think in that case, you want to have a little bit more. you want to have your value system set ahead of time because a younger child is looking to you to determine their value system. So maybe you would have that with the other caretakers in your family of how important is this to us? What values or messaging are we trying to send our child? And then with a younger child, you want to also give more direction about um, I can imagine that you're coming into the doctor's office really hot because you're nervous about what's going to happen or all this new sensory input and all of this stuff. Unfortunately, it's not appropriate for this situation to behave this way, but we can help you with those feelings with this instead, whether it's a sensory toy or, like I said, a phone to distract them. The options are kind of limitless, but there with a younger child, you want to have a little bit more, you want to take the lead a lot more in determining what is appropriate and what's not, and then giving them alternatives for funneling that energy and those feelings.
And maybe a social story or something,
Yeah, that would
improve
be.
viewing too.
Mhm.
My young adult son didn't have an ADHD diagnosis in his school years, so I didn't have any interventions or supports. What do you suggest for a person just starting to address their ADHD, especially around the struggle of motivation and feeling almost frozen?
I actually am working with a client now who um, second year into college and they just recently got diagnosed. So they lived, a good portion of their life experiencing ADHD, but not knowing that's what it was. So I empathize with them. I think the biggest thing is to support them in psychoeducation. So that's learning about ADHD, learning how different symptoms can manifest, different ways that it can impact them, learning about their specific ADHD because ADHD presents in lots of different ways, so that they can better understand what's connected with their ADHD and what's not. I think if you're diagnosed later in life, or even at this point, you might have over identified with your ADHD or your executive function struggles. So again, like I'm just bad with time. I'm just whatever, fill in the blank. So, doing the psychoeducation around what ADHD is and how it impacts them can help them kind of tease apart their identity a little bit more, which is in some ways developmentally appropriate for this age because in these years they're forming their identity. Um, and then I think once you have that psychoeducation, you may also want to say, these are all the different options we have for supporting you at school and at home. But really, the first step is them understanding their diagnosis and understanding themselves.
Great. And are you, I guess we have a few minutes left here, or just a minute or two. Would you be able to get to some of the scripts and kind of examples?
Yes, I can. Thank you for reminding me. So let me go back to that slide. Here we go. Okay, so um, for the letting your child experience struggle and mistakes, but supporting them through it, some examples. I wonder if I could actually. Do you mind if I swap my share screen to something else? And then sneaky with it here. Okay. So these are some examples of the kind of phrasing that you could use if you're supporting your child through a mistake. You first want to make sure to validate their emotions and their experience because if they've made a mistake, they're going to be emotionally overwhelmed or dysregulated. And when you're in a state of emotional overwhelm, you have less access to your prefrontal cortex, less access to your thinking brain. So once you've kind of co regulated with your child and they're feeling calmer, then you can guide them through the repair part of their mistake by saying, I know it was a mistake, and now we just need to figure out how to fix it. What do you think we should do? So, this is really great to kind of, it is still their responsibility. It is still something that they need to work through. So, it's a really good learning experience for them. and you're giving them a chance to practice that mental flexibility of what are the different ways we could solve this problem. But you're still offering to talk them through it and support them with it. You could ask them what are the next steps we need to take. If they're not sure about the whole solution, they might know the first step. So, for example, I forgot to mention the example. There's a student who's taking driving lessons after school, and they were doing the driving lessons right there at the high school. The teacher was coming to pick them up, but they forgot about the appointment and they got on the bus and they went home. So in this example, your child may not know everything on how to fix this, but they would potentially know that the first step is to call or text the driving instructor to say, I'm so sorry I got on the bus instead. And then from there, you can kind of build up what the full solution should be. Another example of what you can say is, I can tell you what I think we should do, but I would love to hear your ideas first. Where would you start? So then you're just guiding them through the problem solving. And throughout all of that, you're not being judgmental. You're not saying, God, why do you do this? You really should have da, 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 da. You're helping them figure out how to repair right now. And then maybe even later, you can come back for another follow-up conversation about how to prevent this from repeating in the future. So let me switch back to the slides. Were there any other questions or things to review?
Yep, just one other question. What are some potential resources to help parents have those psychoeducational conversations?
So a really great resource is to look into conscious parenting. It's a style of parenting that kind of follows the whole validate and co-regulate with your child, and then help teach them the executive functioning or life skills that you actually want them to be able to employ. So you can look into conscious parenting. I also have a list of resources related to that I can include in our follow-up to the webinar. There's also a list of resources here. These resources are a little more focused on understanding what executive functioning is and how it can impact families. But included in here is the Child Mind Institute Family Resource Center. They are fantastic. They have a whole host of different resources. You can search by diagnosis, you can search by age. They have videos to show your children. It's really fantastic. And then, of course, the NESCA blog, because we talk about really interesting topics and give lots of really solid advice in the blogs. The other thing that we wanted to share is that I will be sending out, or Jane will be sending out, a post-webinar Google form just to get your feedback on today's webinar, but also to gauge interest in a potential follow-up Ask the Expert session, as well as a webinar that we'll be doing in October, where I talk through case studies of real life EF coaching success stories. So you can hear a little bit more about the specific strategies I employed in each case, but it would be around a case study so you could see how it is that I individualize for each client, which I think is really the best thing. It's you can get a whole list of resources and suggestions, but I think the best skill that you can develop as a caregiver or parent is to figure out how to individualize for your child.
Yeah, and just also to mention, in addition to the resources that Jasmine mentioned, NESCA does offer psychoeducational counseling to students, parents, families to kind of help them work through some of those conversations as well. I know that we are a little over on time. I really appreciate everyone sticking around and joining. Please feel free to reach out to me and or Jasmine directly with any questions you have, and I will be sharing that Google form and also the presentation over email within the next day or so. So thank you so much for your time, and hopefully you found everything helpful.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.